Hello and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we share insights about the future of agriculture. Each week we dive into the stories, technologies, and ideas shaping a profitable and sustainable future for farms and rural communities alike. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the AgCulture Podcast, and today I'm having a conversation with Mike Steenhoek, who is the Executive Director of the Soy Transportation Coalition here in the U.S. Now, most farmers spend their lives focused on production, raising their crops or animals, managing the weather, their feed, their fertilizer, and markets. But after the commodity leaves the farm, an entirely different system takes over that many farmers just have a vague idea of. This is the system that actually connects the supply, the farmers, to the demand, the customers of the commodities. Most of us use transportation every day in our businesses, but yet really don't put an emphasis or much thought into what allows transportation to be efficient and the infrastructure behind that. On today's episode with Mike, we're going to pull back the curtain on the infrastructure behind the transportation that is necessary to get our products as farmers to market. Mike has a detailed understanding of this infrastructure and the challenges and opportunities that it presents to U.S. farmers. So I can guarantee you're going to get educated on today's episode. So with that, here's my interview with Mike Steenhoek. Well, Mike Steenhoek, welcome to the AgCulture Podcast. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today about how commodities move and your role in that. So welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I want to start out our discussion. So as most farmers, we get our commodity grown and produced, and we bring it to our local processor or our grain elevator in town, and that's as far as we take it. Once we got it sold there, once we got it brought there, we're done, right? So I really want to focus today on what does it look like after a farmer delivers that product to the processor or to their local elevator. And you've got great experience in that. I would like you to start out talking about, I'm a central Illinois soybean farmer. I bring my bushel of soybeans to the local elevator. What happens to it now, and what's the importance of the infrastructure that goes behind that?
Yeah, and one of the temptations that historically has been with farmers is that for them to kind of regard any subsequent transportation steps or links in the supply chain after they make that delivery, well, that's someone else's problem. That's the grain elevator's problem. That's the soybean processor's problem. That's the ethanol plant's problem. And the reality is it really has an impact on an individual farmer's bottom line and the money that's actually in their wallet. I think it's first, important to kind of just set the stage that of all of the things planted and grown in the United States, soybeans are consistently, not every single year, but consistently the number one agricultural export. And over 50% of the total value of what soybean farmers grow on an annual basis in this country ultimately finds its way in another country to an international market. And so if that's the reality of your industry, which it is, then success for this industry, it's not just a function of growing a sufficient amount or quality of soybeans, and it's not just a function of having demand for those soybeans and the products derived from them. The third element of that is that linkage or that connectivity between supply and demand. And that's what our transportation system does. That's what our supply chain actually achieves. And so one of the things that we really try to focus on is that, just kind of more broadly speaking, is that transportation cost, and we'll get into the specifics of some of it relates to trucking. There's a barge element to it on the inland waterway system. There's a rail element to it. And there's an ocean vessel element to it if it's going to an international market. The bigger that number is, the bigger that cost number is, and you add those modes of transportation together and you arrive at a cost number, the bigger that number is, the more transportation is an impediment or an obstacle to farmer profitability. The smaller that number is, fewer cents per bushel, fewer cents per metric ton to deliver that product, the more transportation is facilitating farmer profitability. So again, it's really tempting for farmers, once they make that delivery, to say, well, that's someone else's responsibility now. And yes, farmers aren't actually managing that shipment, but it all relates to how viable, how competitive soybean farming is in this country. is that transportation element. So that's why the organization was created, to really focus on all of those ways to make our supply chain more cost effective, more reliable, more competitive. And so it really kind of focuses on each of those links of the supply chain.
Yeah, that's a great preface for really understanding the crucial points of the whole system. If you look at it from a end user standpoint, if you have an end user off the shore of the U.S., they have a specific price that they're able to pay for that if they're going to feed their animal with it in a different country or use the byproduct soybean oil or something like that. They have a specific price that they can pay for it to make it useful in their supply chain or in their process. So the more of that goes toward transportation, the less of that can go to the farmer.
Yeah, and while we in the United States, we regard the soybeans grown in this country as the highest quality on the planet, and there's certainly reasons to have and defend that reputation. The fact still remains that it is a commodity, and it's a very price sensitive commodity. We're not making iPhones, for example, where if you have an increase in cost in your manufacturing process, there is pretty robust demand for that product, and maybe you can pass those costs on to the customer. The customer will pay for it. We don't really have that luxury within the soybean industry. Agriculture really doesn't have that luxury in so many of the various products that are grown. And so if we all of a sudden have an increase in the cost of production, or relevant to the Soy Transportation Coalition, if there's an increase in cost in the supply chain, whether it's a fuel cost increase, whether there's some kind of deficiency or problem that arises, engineering problem that arises, maintenance issue on one of those areas of the supply chain, our ability to simply say, well, let's just pass those costs on to our customers in another country. The customer will respond by saying, well, maybe today's a good day to start buying more from Brazil, or maybe it's a good day to buy more from Argentina. So you're really restricted in how much you can pass those costs on to the customer. So what happens? Well, those costs are either absorbed by the shipper, the intermediary, whether it's a large agribusiness, a grain handler, a grain elevator, or what most commonly happens is those costs are passed on to the farmer in the form of a lower price at that point of sale. The term is often used as basis. That basis is the discrepancy between the price that is offered to a farmer at the local point of sale and the price that the market value of that commodity established at the Chicago Board of Trade. So that basis number can either be more negative, where it's deviating more from that market value. Sometimes it can actually be positive too. But what you often see is within transportation that those costs are passed on to the farmer. So if you have a 30-cent increase per gallon in the cost of diesel fuel, or if all of a sudden you have a lock on the inland waterway system in Mississippi River, for example, that all of a sudden has a breakdown, or you'll see it very dramatically where you might have a hurricane arrive at the Mississippi Gulf region by New Orleans and all of a sudden shuts down for a period of time our number one export region for soybeans onto the international marketplace. Those kind of disruptions, those kind of cost increases, those tend to get passed on to the farmer. So again, back to the question, why should farmers care about not only the transportation system that they rely on to get product from the farm to the initial delivery location, but also some of these subsequent modes of transportation like rail, like barge, like ocean? Those things find a way to get rewound back onto the price that they are offered at that initial point of sale. So farmers are the ones who actually pay for it. And that's one of the things that we've really worked very diligently on for a number of years, is really trying to explain that to farmers. So it definitely merits their attention. Of course, they don't interface with Union Pacific or Norfolk Southern Railway on a daily basis, or barge company XYZ, but it does have very much relevance to their individual profitability.
Yep. Now, you just mentioned a whole bunch of different forms of transportation and mentioned a lot of the infrastructure in the transportation business to move soybeans and other commodities throughout the U.S. So let's dig a little bit more in depth into each one of those and the importance of each one of those in the role that it plays.
There's three main modes of transportation that farmers really utilize. There's truck, there's rail, there's barge, and then of course, if it's an international destination, an ocean vessel component to it as well. If it's more of a domestic movement where the consumption will be domestic, say you live in an area where there's a lot of livestock production and a lot of pork production, a lot of poultry production, and of course those animals consume a lot of soybean meal, that's going to be more of a truck reliant supply chain where you're delivering from the farm to a soybean processing or crush facility. The soybean meal, if it's not too far away, will be trucked to a livestock intensive area. Or same thing applies if you're having biodiesel or renewable diesel, produced. Same thing for ethanol on the corn side. But then if you're also with domestic consumption as well, a lot of the livestock and a lot of the soybean processing is happening far removed, yet within this country, but still far removed from where the production areas are. So you'll have a lot of livestock in California, for example. A lot of renewable diesel is produced in California. You'll have a significant livestock in the southeast part of the United States. And so that'll be more of a initial truck movement, goes onto a rail car for the long haul movement, going hundreds of miles by rail, and then it gets to the consumption area. Now, if you're looking at an export movement, there will still be an initial truck movement that's usually shorter in length, and then it'll go on to either one of the two modes of transportation that are very well equipped and positioned to transport heavy commodities like soybeans, like corn, long distances in an economical and an environmentally sustainable method. And that's rail, or it's the inland waterway system with barge transportation. So that's one of the secrets to our success long term, is that we've developed these modes of transportation and the infrastructure around it to be able to position farmers that are located in the middle of the United States, in states like Illinois, like Iowa, like Minnesota, Kansas, et cetera, hundreds of miles removed from our coastal regions, but yet they can be active participants in the international marketplace because you have these modes of transportation that can transport these commodities long distances in an economical manner. So if you're in a farmer that's in the soybeans you grow will ultimately be exported, and if you're located in, let's say, a state like Illinois or Kentucky, Eastern Iowa, that will often there'll be a truck movement, and then it'll go to a barge loading facility on whether it's the Mississippi River, the Illinois River, the Ohio River, Arkansas River, Missouri River, and then it'll have a barge movement that'll take a couple weeks to get down to our export facilities near the New Orleans area. 55 to 60% of soybean exports depart from the Mississippi Gulf region near New Orleans. The barges will be unloaded and then loaded into an ocean vessel, and then it goes to a variety of international destinations. It takes about 30 days to get from the New Orleans area through the Panama Canal to a customer in Asia, for example, China. If you're a state that's further west of the Mississippi River, that you're quite removed from the inland waterway system, the Mississippi River and the Ohio River, et cetera, there's going to be an initial truck movement, and then it'll go to a rail loading facility where then you'll have about a 5-day journey to get from, say, North Dakota, South Dakota, Western Minnesota to export terminals in the Pacific Northwest. That region of the country accounts usually for about 25, sometimes approaching 30% of our exports. That's our number 2 export region. So we have a lot of export facilities that are located along the Columbia River that separates Oregon and Washington. There's a couple located at Puget Sound, which that's the body of water adjacent to Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. So there's a collection of these export facilities there. And then you're looking at about a 10-day journey, 10 to 12-day journey to get to a customer in Asia. So those are the two main. If it's an export movement, the Mississippi Gulf and the Pacific Northwest, we will actively rail a lot of product down to Mexico. Mexico is a very important customer of ours. And then we also, one of the things that's really been on vivid display and a very poignant reminder for us, especially since COVID, is the need from a supply chain perspective to not put all of your eggs in one basket. The more you can spread your eggs across multiple baskets, the better positioned you are for success. So we remember all these supply chain disruptions that we had in the United States. Well, one of the morals of that story and takeaways is don't put all of your eggs in one basket. So one of the things that you see the Soy Transportation Coalition really emphasize is, yes, continue to really prioritize the Mississippi Gulf and the Pacific Northwest, but also be actively engaged in promoting exports through the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway, also via the Atlantic coast, the Texas Gulf. And the more you can do that, the better position you are for success. We live in a time right now that the global economy has a lot of uncertainty, a lot of turmoil to it right now. And so when that's the case, then having a more resilient, redundant system is really going to help you better withstand some of those shocks that occur.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I guess in your role with being in charge of the soy transportation, what are you trying to do? Is it mostly policy driven to get those avenues open, or is it working with transportation companies to say, hey, this is really where you should be looking at building a new terminal, a new port, new rail terminal?
Yeah, it can really be all of the above. And so, just a really good recent example that could just kind of illustrate some of the kind of the work that we've done elsewhere. A few weeks ago, a group of us were in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, at the Port of Milwaukee. Of course, that's located on Lake Michigan. And what we did is we presented a ceremonial check of $200,000 to help with an expansion of a soybean meal and grain export terminal located there. The company, the DeLong company, is actually the company that owns the facility. And so what we did was, again, because we're wanting to help improve the resilience of our supply chain, the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway is never going to rival the Pacific Northwest or the Mississippi Gulf in terms of volume that's shipped. But again, it's all about trying to increase the resiliency and the redundancy of the supply chain. And one of the beauties of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway, is it really helps you position you well to tap into some of these markets in Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and that whole kind of area of the world. And so we actually provided some funding. And again, we had this ceremonial check presentation a few weeks ago to that company. And the goal of it was to not only provide some financial support for this expansion, but then also they were applying for a federal grant through a federal government agency called the U.S. Maritime Administration. It's under the U.S. Department of Transportation. And they have a grant program to help assist with port developments and infrastructure enhancements, whether they're large ports or they could even be small and medium-sized ports. And so one of the things that we were hoping to do was to help increase the likelihood of them receiving that grant. One of the things that we've seen repeatedly is that when you're applying for a grant, if you can demonstrate as the applicant that there are stakeholders involved that are not just requesting that funding or advocating for it, but actually putting some skin in the game, putting their money where their mouth is, that's a further demonstration of commitment to that project and really enhances the attractiveness by those government agencies to invest in it. Because you know that you're partnering with folks that are also putting skin in the game. And so we were very happy to see this. So we had provided this funding, but then they were able to get a $9.3 million grant through the U.S. Maritime Administration. So it was a really good partnership between the company, the DeLong company, and they're the main heroes of the story. Port Milwaukee as well. They're certainly, and the state of Wisconsin was a part of it also. But then also soybean farmers being a participant in this as well to really help promote a particular solution. And we've done the similar projects elsewhere. We got a couple in the Pacific Northwest. We did one on the lower Mississippi River, one in the Port of Virginia. So really kind of having this broad kind of approach to it. But it really just kind of demonstrates that these are the kind of things that we're really excited about. And farmers really are excited about it because, farmers, they have a lot of areas where they can devote their resources as an organization. The Soy Transportation Coalition, we're governed by a board of 29 farmers from throughout the country. And what farmers really appreciate about projects like this is that they're real. They're not just a report that has a bunch of pretty pie charts on it. This is something that is real. And when farmers actually go to that facility, for example, at Port Milwaukee, but then the other ones that we've been involved with around the country, they don't have to guess whether the supply chain for the soybean industry has been enhanced. They can see it clearly with their own eyes. And they also don't have to guess whether they played a role in helping achieve that outcome. Those are the things that we're really excited about. We really want to focus on, is it tangibly moving the needle? And is it something that's real, that clearly is making the world a little bit better for soybean farmers tomorrow than it is today?
That's a great example of what you guys are doing to leverage your role in the industry and really expanding that beyond your organization. So appreciate that. Looking at bottlenecks in the current infrastructure that we have in the U.S., what are you keeping an eye on? What are you concerned a bit about for the future that we should really be aware of in the agricultural community?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of them that I tend to we've got challenges and opportunities with all of our links in the supply chain, but there's a couple in particular that are particular concern for us. One relates to the inland waterway system and with barge transportation, and there's certain areas of the inland waterway system where you have this inventory of locks and dams, and the dams were built originally to ensure that that section of the river would provide at least a 9-foot or greater navigation channel. In times of low water, low precipitation, you have dams that can act to help slow or resist the flow of water past that point. It builds up water behind that dam, helps elevate water levels to have that 9-foot or greater channel. You have a lock adjacent to the dam so that you can have barge transportation navigate around that dam. And a lot of these lock and dam sites were actually built in the 1930s. During the Franklin Roosevelt administration in response to the Great Depression. And a lot of them are, while they've been maintained over the years, they still are showing their age. And to replace and to maintain these assets will always be a very expensive endeavor. But one of the things that's really of concern to us and to many others is that you're seeing increasingly very grotesque, I would say, cost overruns and project delays. It's one thing to have an expensive capital project. We're accustomed to that. We build roads, bridges, football stadiums, airports, assets, capital projects that have very large price tags. But not always do you have significant cost overruns and project delays. Sometimes you're under budget and within the time horizon. Sometimes you might have a 10% or 20% cost overrun. What we're seeing with a lot of these lock and dam projects are a 100%, 200%, even 300% cost overrun. So imagine that you've got a project that cost originally $500 million. That's expensive. Now all of a sudden it's costing $1.5 billion. And so the solution to that is not just throw more money at it. We have to find ways as a nation to be able to practice better stewardship of taxpayer dollars, because I don't think there ever will be a time where we are so flush with money where we can just do these kind of projects throughout the country with consistent 100%, 200%, 300% cost overruns. So we really have to get control over that. The other area that is a particular concern relates to the first link in the journey from the farm to the ultimate consumer, and that is our rural roads and bridges. Consider agriculture that farmers are producing more on the farm. That's a good thing. You often have longer distances that those farmers need to travel. You still have a lot of farmers that deliver to the local grain elevator 5 to 10 miles away, but increasingly you're having farmers elect to transport further distances, 40 miles, 50 miles, sometimes over 100 miles, because they can get a better market for the soybean or for whatever they grow. So you're having longer distances. You have larger machinery that's being used to harvest these crops. And you have the more prevalence of trucks that are accommodating what's produced. So you've had this evolution within agriculture, but yet you've got this rural infrastructure that was really designed and created with early to mid 20th century agriculture in mind. So you have a lot of these rural roads and rural bridges that are just really not well positioned and equipped to handle what they're being tasked with. At the same time, you've got a tax base in rural America that is either stagnant or on the decline. So you don't have to be a mathematician to predict that there's going to be a problem when you've got a stagnant or declining tax base, when you've got in revenue, when you've got more demand imposed on the system. And if you've got rural bridges that can easily cost $300,000, $500,000, upwards of $1 million, and we're not talking about the Golden Gate Bridge, we're talking about rural short span bridges that don't look very remarkable when you see them, but yet they provide a very notable function. You can clearly see that the ends are not going to meet. And so that's a real continuing problem. So what's the solution? Do you just pin your hopes on the federal government and state government and local government arriving somehow with a sufficient amount of money to just do everything that we need to do? Well, that is a strategy, but I don't think that's going to be a successful one. Yes, we need more investment, and we'll continue to promote that. But you also have to look at the cost side of the equation. How can you get more bang for your buck? And so one of the things that we actively pursue and promote is more cost-effective ways for counties, municipalities to replace rural bridges for a fraction of the cost. There's innovative approaches that are very safe from an engineering perspective, but yet haven't been widely implemented and utilized. And so one of the things that we've continued to do is call attention to those concepts. We're talking about replacing a rural bridge for $100,000 versus $300,000. Massive savings. And actually providing some funding for counties if they want to adopt one of these innovative approaches. There'll be some of that funding will be used to help offset the cost of that so that it helps really kind of encourage them to maybe try something new and try something innovative. Still has to be safe. That's the most important box that needs to be checked. But I think we are fooling ourselves if we just think that we will be able to take care of all of this rural infrastructure. In many counties in the Midwest, you can easily have 100, 200, 300 plus bridges in a single county. And we're fooling ourselves if we think that we will have all of the funding available somehow, some way to be able to properly maintain and improve that entire system. So we need to be able to look at it from a stewardship perspective as well.
Yeah. And do you see any big bottlenecks in the rail side of things, or has that been taken care of by the rail system itself?
Yeah, the rail system is privately funded. So there still is, there's federal and state interface still from a government perspective with the rail system. And we obviously interface with railroads. It's privately funded. Now you can have challenges and this ebbs and flows where rates have gone up or service issues have materialized. Currently, most grain shippers that we interface with have pretty favorable things to say about the current state of rail service. Now, that can change on a dime. And of course, there's a lot of attention right now on this proposed acquisition of Norfolk Southern Railway by Union Pacific Railroad. That's something that's going to be a big topic of discussion for the next year plus. And some who support it, and some within agriculture, some who support it, and some who are adamantly opposed to it. But that tends to be more, challenges sometimes with reduction of service or infrequent service or cost increases. Those kind of things can materialize right now. Again, rail service has been pretty favorable.
Okay. Well, that's a great look into the potential issues that are facing us. And there's a lot of those in rural America, as we saw the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, as you mentioned, the 1930s, 40s, and then the post-war World War II boom. A lot of that infrastructure was built in that really 20-year window, and it's starting to age out. It's 80 to 100 years old now, and that bill's coming due again, right?
It is, and I wish that people got as excited about saving money as they are about generating money for projects, or they would be just as excited about maintaining a system as they are about creating something new. That's kind of human nature. But you can make the taxpayer dollar stretch so much further if you are just very attentive to preventative maintenance. The best time to respond to a mechanical failure is before the failure rather than after the failure. And so we do need kind of more of that mentality. I think farmers are the perfect advocates to make that kind of message because, think about a farmer. I don't know of any successful farmer that when some kind of problem manifests itself on the farm, could be an equipment issue, malfunction, breakdown, etc. I don't know of a single farmer that says, you know what the solution to this is? Getting out my credit card and paying a lot of money and throwing a lot of money at it. Successful farmers, their default position is, okay, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and see if I can kind of figure this out and maybe be innovative. And if I do A and B, or instead of doing A and B, maybe I do A and C, maybe I could fix the problem and get me through a planting and growing season. That's the kind of innovative thinking that farmers typically employ on their farm. And if that mentality works so well on the farm, obviously it's going to work well when it comes to maintaining and improving our infrastructure. So we need a lot more of that thinking about taking care of what you have first. And yes, we do need to acquire things that we don't have, build things that are new. That's quite apparent. But having that kind of more of that stewardship mentality, that's something that's really critical. I think it's important just to remember that if you want to be an investment country, instead of a spending country, we're kind of a spending nation where we just allocate resources today in exchange for immediate gratitude, immediate value. When you invest, you allocate resources today in exchange for value tomorrow. And if you want to be an investing nation, that's not just a one-time event. That's kind of a perpetual event, not only taking care of what you have, but then also acquiring what you don't have.
Yep. No, that's a really good point, and one that I think many people in roles of government need to probably get their head around a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to allocate some funding toward a project and then just only take notice of it when it's the ribbon cutting moment and then waiting for it to break down. Well, what you really need to do is just you need to keep being attentive to it and practicing that 365-day a year stewardship mentality. And that'll get you a long ways. And again, farmers practice that on their farms. We're trying to see that mentality more embraced when it comes to our infrastructure.
Yeah. One thing I want to pivot back to is the disruptions that can happen in a system. And obviously, we're seeing that right now in real time with the Iran conflict. There's always news stories every day. Hey, it might get resolved today, and then it doesn't. So what has that specific conflict done in terms of backlog of ships, of issues in the transportation industry that is affecting farmers today?
Yeah, I mean, the most notable one is the whole impact on the cost of fuel. One of the things that it's worth repeating is that this is not just a number on a sign. This cost per gallon for diesel fuel and, of course, for gasoline for general motorists. That's something that has real impact on a farmer's bottom line, on a grain elevator's bottom line. It can easily the kind of cost escalations that we've seen over the last couple months can easily add a couple $1,000s to a farmer just in the delivery cost to get product from the farm to the delivery location. And then, of course, a farmer's consumption of diesel fuel is not just confined to moving product from the farm to the elevator or to the processor or the barge loading facility. It also, of course, they use it on the farm on a daily basis. Farmers, of course, they will make their fuel purchases at various increments throughout the year. And so, a lot of farmers had already purchased a significant amount of fuel prior to this conflict arising, but they're going to have to replenish that as they make progress with planting and the growing season. And so those costs are going to have to be incurred. For a grain elevator, that difference can be, well in excess of $100,000. Just a one single grain elevator can incur in higher fuel costs because of just the additional costs that we've witnessed over these last couple months. These are industries and these are individuals that operate on very tight margins. Agriculture, typically, we don't have a lot of slack in the profit margin. It's very narrow, very tight. And so you make your money by having a very small profit margin and then multiplying that by thousands, if not millions of bushels. And now all of a sudden you've got this increased cost in fuel, which I describe as just one more leak in the profitability bucket for farmers and grain elevators and other participants in the industry. So that's clearly a huge issue. Of course, farmers, having access to fertilizer, that's going to be compromised as well. A lot of farmers, again, they did make their purchases earlier in the year or late last year. But again, this whole system for these fertilizers, this supply chain system being disrupted. One of the things that I try to just keep in mind, I think this analogy is useful, is that when it comes to supply chains, it's kind of analogous to a relay race at a track and field meet, is that, when the track conditions are smooth and favorable, and if the runners are practiced and rehearsed, and if weather is favorable, you can advance that baton pretty quickly and efficiently around the track. But if all of a sudden some tripping hazards emerge on the track, or if the runners aren't well rehearsed, and if maybe weather is inclement, then all of a sudden it's going to be much more cumbersome, much less efficient to move that baton around the track. And that's what's essentially happened right now with our global supply chain is that you've got, you look at a map of the globe and you see how vast our oceans are, but then, consider the fact that there are a number of particularly important pinch points where the vastness of those oceans kind of narrow down and concentrate in certain areas. And if something goes awry at those limited areas, the Strait of Hormuz being clearly an example, could be the Panama Canal, could be the Suez Canal, could be the Strait of Gibraltar. There's a number of these places that if something awry occurs, it can have a dramatic impact on global shipping. Ports can obviously serve that role as well. And so it's one more challenge confronting our supply chain. And so, global economics, they work really well when you've got predictability and reliability, particularly with industries like agriculture, where your customers are located halfway around the world. it takes, the transactions aren't next day. They are months in advance. And so you need to have some predictability and reliability if you're going to really dip your toe in that industry and sell product or buy product. And all of a sudden, when you've got these kind of disruptions and this uncertainty and this turmoil, it really makes it all the more difficult for industries like agriculture to thrive.
Yep. As we wrap up here, what message do you have for the audience that is in rural America? What do you really want them to understand about agricultural transportation?
It is, that element, that third element to their profitability, and it certainly merits their attention and their concern. And that, a lot of times you think about the economics of an industry, of a company, as really there's two big components of it: supply and demand. If you do well in both of those areas, you'll be profitable, you'll be successful. Well, the third element, in particular for agriculture, is transportation. That's what connects supply and demand. And so you can grow an exceptional volume of soybeans, and they can be of the highest quality, and you can have significant demand for those soybeans and the products derived from them. But if you have a breakdown with transportation, you will not be successful as an industry. And so that's why the organization was created, the Soy Transportation Coalition. That's why soybean farmers are really attentive to this issue, and they've really prioritized it. And that's what we really focus on a daily basis is, back to that cost number. The bigger that number is, the more it's an impediment to profitability. The smaller that number is, the more it facilitates profitability. So we talk a lot about subtraction math instead of addition math. And everything that we do, it really you're trying to distill it down to making that number, that cost number, smaller, reducing cents per bushel, reducing dollars per ton to deliver soybeans or soy products to our customer. The more you're engaging in subtraction math, the more you're helping the future of soybean farmers. Whenever you see addition math, the more difficult it's going to be. And so we really focus on subtraction math.
Well, Mike, thank you for that. And thank you for what you do in your role for the industry. And really appreciate you sharing your knowledge today. I was really interested in this topic and how things move and understanding the importance of the logistics. So you did a great job educating us on that. So thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you once again for listening to the AgCulture Podcast. I hope you enjoyed that conversation that I had with Mike and hope you learned a little bit more about transportation and infrastructure behind that for rural commodities. Now, if you want to check out in more detail some of the work that Mike is doing as Executive Director of the Soy Transportation Coalition, I recommend that you check out their website. He did mention that they also have a newsletter that they send out on a regular basis to give updates of what's going on and news in the infrastructure and transportation sectors pertaining to soy. And as always, I just want to say thank you to our friends of the show that help support the work that we are doing to bring you these podcasts ad-free, commercial-free. Check them out. Go to the website. Look them up. And with that, we'll see you next week for another episode of the AgCulture Podcast. Thanks for listening.